Thank you. Thank you very much. It's wonderful to get a warm applause for arriving. For some of you, I'm familiar, your teaching team in particular. Many of you I haven't met yet, and I look forward to that. My name is Holmes Hummel, and Sandra Begay, who is the only Indigenous voice on the advisory council to Stanford School for Sustainability, offered me some advice. She said, never speak without telling someone where you've come from. It's important for them to understand the context and how they might interpret and regard what you have to say. And then she proceeded to do the exact same thing when she addressed audiences at Stanford as our guest a couple of years ago. So heeding her advice, I'm going to open with my path to meet you in this moment. Of course, you're all literate and can read through a list of bullets, but I'm going to take you through that narrative quickly because, of course, I identify strongly with the potential you have in your own path. Casting yourself forward 30 years might seem impossible, but now think of this as a 30-year story to meet you in this moment. When I finished high school, I decided not to go to college and to stay out of school just to build a lightweight automobile powered with renewable energy using batteries and electric drivetrains that were all special order at the time. With a team of 60 college students, we competed against other schools and raced that contraption across the United States in a Department of Energy sponsored competition called Sun Race 95. Flash forward 30 years, Stanford's solar car competes in a very similar type of competition and comes in number 2 in the field. Very impressive and after my own heart. Now, I did eventually decide to carry on with my education, and I came here. And the first thing I did was sign up for courses with Gil Masters and Jane Woodward. Together, they've taught more than 10,000 Stanford students, ushering in literally a generational wave into the energy sector. Now, I finished my degrees and did what a lot of people in that era and this do. I joined a startup. It was in the software industry, and I worked on enterprise energy solutions for very large companies from the vantage point of a disruptive startup. It was fantastically fun. I do recommend it, and it was infuriating. Every time we would get to a chief financial officer with a value proposition that we knew was compelling, they would shake their heads and say, the decision frame that we're working in is different than what you've learned. We have incentive structures that are aligned with a different kind of discipline and accountability than what you think. And our decision is going to diverge from what you believe should be the outcome of our investment portfolio. And it was true. We were disappointed over and over again when companies like Intel or Oracle, not to cast shade, would say, well, our return on capital for buying the next chip fab machine is higher than stopping wasting money on wasted energy. So we're just going to keep going with the wasted money on wasted energy program at the cost of all society. I came back to Stanford. I was like, what? That degree did not explain all the things. And in fact, I became a part of the first class of Stanford's new graduate program at the time, Environment and Resources, known here affectionately by its acronym, EIPER, or Interdisciplinary Program on Environment and Resources. During that period, I was able to expose myself to more international networks of discourse and interrogation of all of the different ways to make decisions about energy transitions, including from Europe, the International Institute for Applied Systems Analysis, which recruits from this school every year for that same position to this day. And in the following year, the National Science Foundation support for the East Asia Pacific Summer Institute landed me a spot at Tsinghua University's Energy Research Institute, an absolute life-changing experience that informs my view of China's dominance in energy transitions today. Now, I left Stanford thinking I was going to go right back into the Silicon Valley with this newfound coherency about policy and economics with technology transitions. But I decided that I should pick up some experience in public policy. At least a year. So I competed for one of the 2 positions in the country that an interdisciplinary PhD was even eligible to pursue in the Congressional Science Fellowship Program. And when that became a door was open, it was too good to refuse. I found myself in the office of Representative Jay Inslee, then Governor Jay Inslee, someone you might have known as presidential candidate Jay Inslee, a man who's led on the gold standard for climate policy in the United States for a generation. As you can imagine, that was a life-changing experience. I came back to California and offered the first course on climate policy design at the Energy Resources Group at UC Berkeley. But within that year, Barack Obama was elected president, and people who'd known of my work in DC asked if I would return to the executive branch, since frankly, between you and me, I was a little discouraged about the legislative branch and whether or not legislative aides and their representatives could even ingest the kind of data and information that scientists were bringing to Capitol Hill. Well, my experience in the executive branch was refreshing. It was very different. At the time, the Secretary of Energy was physicist Secretary Stephen Chu, of course, now here once again. And with Stephen Chu's leadership, the discipline of evidence-based decision-making was already instilled almost a decade before a new law was passed on evidence-based decision-making in 2019. Now, yeah, that's right. I did leave the Department of Energy after the first term with some unfinished business, what you'll hear about in my remarks today, but it was the tension between the policies that the administration knew were directionally correct for energy transitions for the United States and the world, and the political tensions and the economics of the political tensions that were facing the administrations that tried to bring along a constituency that was conflicted. I'm going to show you some maps, and we're going to talk about that explicitly. But it was that tension that motivated me to found a social enterprise called Clean Energy Works in combination with community-based, place-based organizations that were seeking and sourcing solutions to their own problems. They were not waiting for anyone to come for them. They knew that they were facing barriers that were insurmountable to even enter the clean energy economy, and that made it by definition impossible for the United States to achieve its promises to the world. The very existence of communities that couldn't get into the clean energy economy were disproving the promises to the world that were being made by the administration that we were going to get there at all. Could you imagine how that would keep me up at night? And so for the next decade, I worked on that problem. I came here in the same year that Stanford launched the School of Sustainability, and the Precourt Institute opened for the first time a program in energy equity and just transitions. It's been my deepest honor to help seed that space and build more networks across the enterprise, including with my compatriot, Dr. Anthony Kinslow, a Stanford graduate, an entrepreneur, and a dedicated educator. I'll show you the classes that he and I teach together at the end of this talk. But I hope that tells you how I arrive at this moment to meet you, very invested in the choices that you might make over the next 3 decades. They won't be the same as these, but now that you can see a little bit of my journey, maybe a piece of it resonates, maybe it sparks some curiosity. When I first started my job at the Department of Energy, the largest solar power station in the country was 1 megawatt. Can you imagine? So, what I've seen since then is explosive, it's exciting, it's definitely compelling. I encourage you to get engaged. And if you were looking for a reference to scale, by the way, that's us. You see that right there? That's us. Come and join us. So now it's time for me to do what I came to do, just contribute to your own education through the context of this course by giving you one drop of policy that I hope will actually reverberate through the rest of the quarter. I'll be offering you some frameworks for thinking about what's happening at a global and a national level, some teasers on the subnational level that you can pick up every time that you turn into a next topic. I hope at the end of today's class, you'll be thinking, gosh, when I learn about buildings, when I learn about the grid, when I learn about finance, I'm going to be thinking about policy. I'm going to return to some of the materials that we think about today and see how they are applicable. I'm going to start at a global level, which is really just a device for a place to get started. And I want to start at a time, a decade ago. The world's heads of state had been negotiating for years at the moment when the global goals were signed. This is the 3rd edition of an international agreement to focus on what a vision of human welfare would look like. It follows the millennial goals and the sustainable development goals before them. How many people have heard of the global goals before? Okay, great. For those that have raised your hands, you won't need further explanation to what looks like it could be a fun bingo card, but let's just put across the basic point that achieving agreement at a head of state level across 17 different dimensions is no small feat. It takes incredible human effort and exercising influence through many chains of command to reach that point. And you might say, Holmes, this is so outdated. A decade ago, really, is that where we are starting? But I want to show you why I think there's still currency and compelling reasons to not turn away from these legacies of convergence, because denying them is actually discrediting or providing an instrument to erasure that's undue. This is a map of the global 20 or G20 countries. And the reason why these G20 agreements can be impactful is because they influence so much of the economic activity that we measure as production or destruction. Sometimes destruction actually produces what's counted as production. That's a whole nother class. But this graph shows you the geographic extent, and this bar chart shows you the concentration among them, especially the huge move in the last decade of where some of that production / destruction is occurring as we're accounting for it on gross terms. The United States is in purple, and in red is the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. That's the acronym for BRICS. Most of what's in the red is China, and if you see the growth in green, I must point out the footnote here that points out the expansion of the EU in the same time frame. The expansion of China's economy during this period is breathtaking. It's historic in human terms. It's worth its own course of study. But I want to show you next that even with this change in composition of power among the group of 20 countries, their most recent declaration, the next one comes out in November, was saturated in the language of the global goals. This is not antiquated. This is like having them renew their vows. And this wasn't with an EU host. India was the host for the Global 20 declaration that came to these conclusions about what should happen next. And I want to point out this entire section on the Green Development Pact for Sustainable Future, which marches right through a whole host of things that align with the global goals, and specifically the ones on energy transition. Let's dive into it just for a couple of excerpts. One, I want to point out the global target for tripling renewable energy capacity signed on to by all 20 of the G20 countries, and doubling the global average rate of energy efficiency improvements. This is identical to what was also included in the most recent agreement under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. You'll see next underlined here, I've provided for you a scale up of investment from all financial sources. That's basically subtext. We're saying private sector and public sector, while still pointing out that countries that are labeled as developing countries need to be supported in their transitions to low carbon emissions, which is an explicit claim for international and even intergenerational justice, so that we can work together, it says, for facilitating low cost financing for them, noting that the G20 doesn't include representatives at the table of a large number of the groups that caucus with the developing countries. They also talked about enabling environments, which is a very specific phrase in policy to talk about market conditions to attract private investments. That's an entire category of work, an entire career of work. And then finally, here I want to iterate a commitment made when the United States hosted the G20 in 2009 to phase out and rationalize over the medium term, which is not to say tomorrow, but not long term, inefficient fossil fuel subsidies. How do you think that the global 20 countries in very recent times, less than 10 months ago, could get to a place where they're reiterating commitments that have been historically discredited by lack of progress at a time when people are looking for leadership and wondering, are we ever going to get there? Is the words in this PDF going to actually mean something? Well, the G20 countries at the heads of state level are still cognizant human beings, and they're aware of this kind of picture, that all of us, every one of us, live in that little white stripe. We live in a biosphere that's not deeper than 20 feet in the ground and not higher than 200, 300 meters in the air. Not 300 meters, 300 yards, feet, I mean. My point is that we live in a biosphere that is so slim and fragile that there is a kind of non-negotiable interdependency. And no matter what the politics are framing the public messaging around any head of state, when they go to sleep at night, they are informed enough to know this kind of picture and what it could mean for them. In fact, almost all of them would have been briefed at the highest level on the most widely read product of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in its history. The summary for policymakers was written explicitly for them. For the ones that are really too busy to read, there is a picture. The first picture basically says, this is what we know about the change in the global average temperature. And there's a danger zone that's well described by atmospheric scientists, physicists, and earth scientists, many of whom have participated in this process from this very university, but also from around the world. And if you believe that that danger zone could be consequential, then you need to regard the time frame in which you are approaching it, which is fast. And in the very same picture, which is figure number 1, below it, there is a stylized emissions path for carbon dioxide. Let me zoom here so we can look at that together. It essentially says that if you would like to have even a 50% chance of meeting your promises to the world, the global greenhouse gas emissions profile will look something like this, which is the mathematical expression of abolition. Abolishing unmitigated fossil fuel combustion in a line graph looks like this. And no head of state missed the chance to be briefed on this report. It's been out for 7 years, widely cited, and this picture is somewhat non-negotiable. In fact, as I've quoted here at the bottom, it's not really a matter of what, but when. Now, in the same report, the accounting for where the greenhouse gas emissions were coming from is well identified and not disputed. The giant majority of it is coming from the energy sector, which is why understanding energy can be consequential for everyone, everywhere, for all practical purposes in human history for all time. If we change the chemistry of the atmosphere in ways that perturb it into irreversible changes, that has consequences that will be traced to this moment. And what the scientists said is, we can't really tell you much about the future because so much of it is interdependent with the culture and policies that will shape consumption and the investments that are made from here going forward. And on the left-hand side, they describe a scenario in which social, business, and technological innovations result in lower energy demand, which we'll talk about in this class in demand-side decarbonization. And on the other hand, over here, a resource and energy-intensive scenario in which economic growth and globalization lead to widespread adoption of greenhouse gas-intensive lifestyles, including high demand for transportation, services, and fuels, and livestock products. The difference between these scenarios depends crucially on the policy frames in which everyone else is making their decisions. And the scientists basically said in their summary to the policymakers, what happens in the future is on you. That is your choice. But of course, it's not entirely theirs. There are all types of other factors, technological innovation, other types of unexpected forces. There are a lot of different dynamics that actually go into forming interdependent and path-dependent futures. But I do want to make a comment here. When Stanford founded the Sustainability Accelerator, it announced to the world that it would have some solution areas. and for the solution areas that it would announce some flagship destinations. It must be noted that the number one first thing that Stanford University invested in was this last sentence: strong use of carbon removal through the deployment of carbon capture and sequestration. And the B and the E here stand for biomass and electricity. So this big yellow swath is essentially a science fiction of today. The idea that there will be some source of energy that is originating with the sun through photosynthesis or other means becoming biomass. The biomass has covalent bonds in it that, when broken, produce heat. That heat may be captured for work, but the carbon dioxide will be saved and somehow fixed away for all time, or at least enough for the planet to restore its thermal energy balance. This is beyond what we know at the scale that it would be required, and this was Stanford's very first sustainability accelerator bet. At the same time, there are many people who are making additional and other bets, including the accelerator itself, which has since then complemented its work with a half dozen other solution areas. But these are profound signals about what people are thinking the policy frameworks and incentives might induce in the future and what might be necessary, and therefore how we might invest. I want to very quickly give you a visual sightseeing visit to another place where you can catch a bird's eye view of energy policy around the world, but at a national level. This is the International Energy Agency's policy database. All of its contents are maintained by the countries themselves. Of course, they have a staff at the headquarters that are helping, but nation states submit and approve the content that is attributed to them. And so it's a pretty good way to just snap around and see, well, what's the snapshot look like in Sweden? What does it look like in South Africa? On the left-hand side, I want to point out policy type, because this is one of the fluencies I want to introduce in today, your only segment that's is explicitly on policy, so that you can start to tune your ear to what different types of instruments. Imagine an orchestra or a dentist office, whichever one gets your imagination. These policy types are also alluding to categories of policy instruments. Trade policies are an entire category, and you've heard a lot of bluster about that for the United States, and explicitly with regard to trade in energy products and imports. Let's put it that way. Incentives and investments is a whole nother category. That's where you'll find the category that might be described from our earlier remarks on fossil fuel subsidies. And I'm going to move to that next. The International Monetary Fund must be regarded as one of the most credible financial institutions on earth for being able to surveil and describe cash flows in the economy, especially between and among countries. But within countries, they're also able to observe domestic policies that may be distorting market signals for investments that could otherwise, perhaps, produce beneficial outcomes aligned with the global goals. And the International Monetary Fund has been beating a drum for a while on fossil fuel subsidies. This here is a report that's not too old, in the last couple of years, describing global fossil fuel subsidies at a scale of $7 trillion a year. The magnitude of that is almost indescribably large. It's like putting a magnet over a compass and watching the compass spin. $7 trillion of explicit subsidies and implicit subsidies is part of the framework of the political economy in which nation states and their representative governments or autocratic governments are trying to steer. This here is a continuation of that report that's describing the implicit subsidies as primarily coming through the prices of retail fuels and pointing out that the retail fuels generally cover the supply costs, but rarely the environmental costs that are then attributed to society and absorbed in damages to health and life expectancy and other types of let's say, malaligned outcomes. You can study your own country of interest in this report, but I want to point out that the IMF went further to try to estimate what would happen if these fossil fuel subsidies were addressed. And they did calculate that it would make a very large difference in the outcome of the trajectory, which brings us back to the special report on emissions that I told you earlier, where the scientists were reporting back to the policymakers, it is your choice what kind of decision frame you give to your private sector actors, including consumers and commercial interests. And if you give them distorted prices, they will give you distorted behaviors. If you're trying to align them with your interests in public welfare, you need to give them some truth in pricing, including the allocation of costs to the places where they can best be managed. So back to this story, the International Energy Agency's account for all of the policies around the world. I want to bring your attention to the one that has the very largest number of examples, and that's regulation. It stands to reason that nation states that are troubled in their ability to internalize the costs to society of harm to the actors that are most responsible for managing those risks to society would turn to another type of instrument, which is regulation. If I cannot give you good price signals that you can respond to, I'm going to start laying down something that looks like the parking bumpers in the parking lot that says, don't drive over this bump. And those regulations are, of course, constantly a source of friction. And the friction is also a source of fuel for animus. People who are frustrated by bumping into that bumper over and over again start to attack the regulation as if it is a harm to their interests instead of regarding that regulation as a protection from them harming the rest of society. And that is the fundamentals of the political economy of government intervention in markets using regulation rather than price-based instruments when there's not enough political capital to actually win the internalization of an externalized cost. So I gave you here a list that I am not going to go through. There's even a longer encyclopedia I'm sure that you could produce or amass yourself. Through the course of this quarter, I hope that you will listen like you were a bird watcher listening for bird songs, for the different types of policies that are being described to you as they affect the deployment rates of different types of energy. One among them that I want to say is underheralded is building codes and appliance standards. These two policies are probably responsible for a larger magnitude of avoided greenhouse gas emissions in the US economy than almost any other single type of policy instrument. Every time we add it up, it's staggering. And these policies are very simple. They say something to the effect of, here is our minimum standard. And if it's lower than that, it's illegal. If you make something that just wastes energy, you cannot sell it here. If you want to build a building that's going to cause the occupant to waste money and wasted energy, we don't accept that. And so at the point of purchase, whether it's for a house or for an appliance, there are rules that are in place with enforcement that say, if your idea of building something is very inefficient, we won't allow it here. Those codes and appliance standards are incredibly powerful. Another category is land use, and particularly the use of public lands. Public lands may be federal, they could be state. There are city parks. These lands have incredible energy resources associated with them. Some of them are mineral or subsurface. Some of them are renewable and on top of the surface. This is a map of this little palette of marine areas defined northeastern coast. They were auctioned off for the first time using the similar processes of auctioning federal lands for grazing or for mineral rights. These were auctioned off for offshore wind. And unceremoniously, earlier this year, the contracts related to those auctions were canceled. So you can start to see a shifting in the winds. So now let's move from policy to politics, because it would be a disservice to you to present policy as some sort of pious study of what is. It is a product of forces that are shaping the decision frames of people who have the authority to enforce within their jurisdictional boundaries a set of conditions that are aligned with their interests. We're going to talk about how their interests are formulated in just a moment. But the basic definition of politics is the process of deciding who gets what. It is essentially a distributive question. And one of the strong themes in contemporary US politics is the accumulation of wealth and the concentration of a small group of actors, and then the use of that concentration of wealth and power by a small group to influence the decision frame of decision makers. And that short circuiting is where I want to get to in just a moment. The histories of energy transitions are actually told through the lens of those politics. This is not salacious stuff that you read in Reader's Digest or some other magazine rag. These are histories of transition that are a part of human histories reported to us with all types of dimensions of depth, including famed authors like Daniel Yergin, one of Jane Woodward's favorites, and famous humanitarians like Arundhati Roy in India. I commend to you these histories, these narratives. They could be from anthropologists, sociologists, historians, and others that are outside of science, technology, engineering, and math. But these histories do carry the stories of how people built and applied power to change the outcomes and the policies that framed the investments that ultimately were produced. The next thing I want to show you is what those transitions look like in the United States over the history of this very short-lived nation. Starting only a couple hundred years ago, the United States began with an entirely biomass-powered economy and has undergone multiple transitions in the last couple of centuries, which is why it stands to reason that we are still undergoing transitions to this day. It's not as if transitions might happen. We're not really sure. Maybe there's one coming. No, my goodness, there are transitions happening all of the time. And next, I want to entertain you with an animation of what this has looked like dynamically over time, while pointing out to you, do you see this 1 pixel wide piece of purple at the top? That's renewable energy, not biomass. So all your wind, all your solar, pretty much all your hydro, it's all up there. And the declared policy of the United States and its promises to the world were to reach this point here by this point, which is steeper in its slope than any of the prior transitions and at a larger magnitude than any of them before. That challenges the imagination, right? But anyone who can do math, it's like, buckle up, people, because that involves a tremendous amount of change. Let me see if I can show you this animation. You'll have about 30 seconds to experience 200 years of energy history. Watch the dynamics. Coal comes into the picture right before the Civil War. It's mostly put into home heating and industrial purposes for high heat. Coal is dominating in the industrialization era. Petroleum enters. The Rockefeller family and Standard Oil, they're driving into the transportation sector. With petroleum production comes gas. The gas is coming out of the ground with the petroleum. But as gas gets more competitive, the investments in gas expand, and ultimately a story of the last generation is a driving out of coal with favor to that lighter hydrocarbon. That's dramatic, isn't it? Every time I see that 30 seconds, I was like, hit that again. Play that one more time. But I want to talk now about the dominant theories of change about why and how this happens. One of the dominant theories is that some things just get cheaper than others. And that if we keep investing in new technologies that become cheaper, then they will just, invisible hand style, drive out something else, and that will foster the transition. But that alone is not a sufficient explanation for what did happen, as you can read in the histories, and is not actually proving to be sufficient in what is happening and the impatience about the credibility of that theory flared in 2019. In 2018, it was December of 2018, right on the eve of the next Congress and the presidential campaign, young people who'd been organizing for years up to this moment expressed their discontent by walking to the United States Congress, to the very highest official of the Democratic Party, only party in the United States that was expressing any interest in energy transition at all, and said something to the effect of, "You are bringing a squirt gun to a wildfire. For as long as we've been alive, this market transformation theory has not been working. You are responsible as a policymaker for giving us a different set of instruments to intervene in what is and what's happening, or we won't have the transition that we already can calculate from our math class would be necessary." And within months, that party was formulating a new position. It built an entire new section of its platform, and with the months after that, it had won the national election. And on the first week, the president signed an executive order that dramatically changed the course of energy policy history up to that point. And Joe Biden signed this executive order tackling the climate crisis at home and abroad. It's a piece of work that's no longer in force because it's been supplanted by the next president's executive order. But in the meanwhile, the language that's in this executive order did saturate other levels of jurisdiction where authorities are still in place and implementing. That's important. One of the things that that executive order did was acknowledge for the first time at this level that it was known to the federal government the landscapes of inequity were actually complicating the politics of transition. And that literally the disparities that were affecting people in different places were producing different levels of readiness for a transition, and places that were not ready, in fact, being harmed by the transition, were pulling back strongly, and their resistance was being fortified by interests in the status quo. So the theory of change was articulated in a different way, which is that if we want the transition to go faster, we have to affirmatively invest in places that have been underinvested. And they even produced a math that the United States Digital Services produced with an algorithm. Data scientists here would love to see how it's produced, and offered a bonus tax credit for investing in certain places that were consistent with these national priorities. This entire policy that was associated with the Energy Communities Tax Credit bonus and the Justice 40 policy were examples of energy justice at work, where proponents of energy justice were changing a process in order to produce a different outcome. The distribution of benefits and burdens in the transition were being changed by a difference in the process to prioritize places that had been underserved. And even approaching this type of policy philosophy meant opening the policy process from edict and fiat to "this is the policy" to actual place-based community engagement, moving, as the International Association of Public Participation would say, from "we'll keep you posted on what our policy is and you should do it," further to the right, to consulting people, to involving people, even going so far as to actually authentically collaborate with place-based organizations about what their transition paths might be, and specifically doing so with communities that have historically been in places dependent on employment from the fossil fuel industries. That's really a dramatic change in the approach to energy transitions in US history. It wasn't only that executive order, but other forces that did ultimately attract enough senators from the Republican Party, which had heretofore not been interested in energy transitions in a meaningful or responsive magnitude, to pass the bipartisan infrastructure law, which had $75 billion of investment in energy transitions in it. And that's not counting the $5 billion in the national electric vehicle infrastructure that was for EV chargers. So all told, north of $80 billion. And it was passed in 2021, which was soon enough for most of this money to be spent. 2 years later, the parts of that original package that had hit the cutting room floor were resuscitated in a post-COVID moment by Senator Joe Manchin and his negotiation with the leader of his party in the Senate, that's Chuck Schumer. They were able to come to terms on an Inflation Reduction Act that was a shadow of its former self, the claims of the Democratic Party's most fervent constituency interested in the Green New Deal. When I tell you that it came at a price, to show you where it started. So the politics of the champions for the Green New Deal brought them to the Hill with a package that was $16,000 billion. Like, whoa, can we count that much? We're like, well, I mean, it's less than 3 years of global fossil fuel subsidies put out over a decade or so. I mean, is that too much to ask for saving all life support systems everywhere for all time? I mean, people can think about it. But when they finally got to articulating their policy package, it was smaller, a little more realistic. It was a resolution that they brought to the members of the party that might be able to carry it forward. But when the president was inaugurated, reality strikes. And the president's version of his own party's platform looks like a shrinky dink that came out of the microwave, but it's still the biggest thing that anybody's ever seen. The American Jobs Plan was sent to Capitol Hill, where it was promptly shrunk further by 3/4. Members of Congress weren't ready to send that kind of bill to their constituents. And ultimately, this package was unpalatable even to the Democratic Party members until one crucial holdout vote was willing to change their mind for a modified package that was smaller. So this became the down payment on transition, because anybody who was involved knew that this was not even approaching what had been widely recognized earlier as being responsive. And still, it was the biggest thing that the federal government had ever done to foment energy transition at a scale and speed that would be responsive. So what did they do with that money? Here's the bar chart that shows both of the two packages together. It also shows you how much more significant the Inflation Reduction Act was for energy transitions than that $80 billion. It was like 4 times bigger. Where the money went also became a hunting ground for the next administration, who used the Inflation Reduction Act like a telephone book for calling cards. Nope. And they went right through pie charts like this to find their biggest areas to slow the transition at the behest of incumbents that were patronizing a party that had historically not been interested in transition. So there's really no change in character here, consistent all the way through. Most of the inducements in the Inflation Reduction Act were on energy supply side solutions, and the instrument that was used most often was tax credits. So it stands to reason that in July of this year, when the new administration used approximately the same legislative pathway called budget reconciliation to authorize a new set of energy policies, one of the first things they did was truncate the length of time at which the tax credits could be claimed across a whole bunch of different categories. One of the things that did actually survive is the energy communities bonus tax credit. I pause here because this is such an overlooked part of the landscape of US energy policy, but it's so vivid. I wouldn't want to spare you the chance to see what federal policymakers already know by calculation. The United States government calculates to the decimal what fraction of the people are employed by fossil-fueled companies and industries that would have that employment displaced by transition. That's in the pink area. And they know where the coal power plants are that would be retired in the attainment of a zero carbon economy. And they also know the counties next door. That's green. And if you are a renewable energy developer, or frankly, a developer of any other energy tax credit that puts your project in one of these shaded areas, you will get an additional 10% of United States tax credit, not tax deduction. That's like monopoly money paid to you. That's so big that it could double your profit margins on your project. The fact that this map exists and that the IRS updates it faithfully every 365 days is so intriguing to me because there's a gripping need to know what the actual political impact of transition would be and where the constituents are that would be affected and how to induce new investments in those areas specifically to be responsive to their interests. So earlier this year, the new president arrived and on his first day was famous for signing a flurry of executive orders. And I gave you in your exercises for today a list of like top 10 best hits that you could go see. This is one of them. And the rhetoric is very, very different than the first executive order of the last president. So you can see how people who are in the energy sector are trying to read what's going on in the weather pattern. Their decision frames are being changed by policy. The president, on the same day that he issued the one on energy dominance, also declared an energy emergency. This one draws attention instantly to see that deep in its definition section, the word energy is redefined to mean everything except solar power, wind, not energy, and other things that actually have dominated the profile of private investment, especially in the power sector for the last 5 years. The largest portion of new additions to generation in the power sector have been in categories that are now being erased from the definition of energy. Well, if you're here in a class called Understand Energy, understanding this is important because this is a change in policy, not a change in reality. The Inflation Reduction Act was then used, as I mentioned, as a hunting ground, and every place that there was a shot, there was a counter shot. The entire conflagration moved to the judicial system, which was instantly under scrutiny for polarization all the way to the top, where the Supreme Court's impartiality was constantly being questioned in the opinion pages of newspapers and other social media outlets that were concerned about whether or not the judgments would be fair and consistent with congressional intent in the authorization of these bills and the contracts that they had ultimately led to in the programs for energy transition. One of the many analyses that were published this year described the number of jobs that would be lost to the clean energy economy if those policies were revoked or those contracts were muted and leave it to the courts to decide whether or not that's legal. They were saying, whatever the courts decide about whether it's legal, we just want to tell you about all the clean energy jobs that are going to be lost. Talk about role reversal. Suddenly there's political analysis that shows that pulling the rug out from under the clean energy transition could be bad for public welfare and the constituents of people who historically had been siding with incumbents, now not so sure. The public spending is one whole category of public attack, and you'll see it in energy in the news, I'm sure, continuing. But there's another place where policy tension is flaring at the federal level, and that is in regulation, a topic we talked about earlier. Think of regulation as an expression of an executive branch, whether it's in a city, a state, or a federal context. Think of it as the authority that the executive branch is authorized to use by the legislative branch. The legislative branch says, we authorize you to regulate such and such. And then they go out and write the rules, and the rules are this. That happened. It actually happened under President Nixon, who was an unlikely hero at a moment when the environmental movement was ascendant in the United States and the Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, and other types of foundational policies were passed. But George Bush the First, in 1992, was the presiding president in an election year when he signed the amendments to the Clean Air Act, and those amendments authorized the federal government to regulate any pollutant that was not already meeting the criteria that Congress had identified. Those are the criteria air pollutants, and there are about half a dozen of them. And the big question was, is carbon dioxide also meeting that same criteria? Is it an endangerment to public welfare? From 1992 to 2006, 14 years of debate. Is carbon dioxide pollution endangering public health? Finally, Massachusetts takes the United States government to court. You're violating your statutory obligation to decide whether or not it's an endangerment. And the Supreme Court sided with Massachusetts in a famous judgment, Mass versus EPA. Massachusetts is right. EPA has to decide. The president at the time was the second George Bush term, or the second George Bush term for the second George Bush. And they kind of sat on it. In fact, famously, they were sent an email from the EPA's team, and the administrator said, well, I didn't open the email, so I didn't read it. And if I didn't read it, then I didn't have to act. So the clock expired. It's like watching a sports game where somebody's just leaning out the clock. So sure as the world, it's the first 6 months of 2009. Barack Obama has appointed Lisa Jackson, now the global head of environment at Apple, to be the EPA administrator. And she turns her attention to the Supreme Court ruling that orders her agency to act and puts together the most robust case the world has ever seen that carbon dioxide is endangering public health. In the first 6 months of this new administration, the EPA appointed by the current president turns to the American public and says, I'm not so sure about that judgment back there from 2009. We're going to reopen the case. We're going to reopen the case because it turns out if we can find that carbon dioxide is not an endangerment, then we don't have to regulate it. And if we don't have to regulate it, also we have some leverage over states that are taking actions to regulate. Ooh, those are some fighting words. So the National Academies of Sciences, what am I? Flashing forward. This is last week. Just last week, a consensus study from the National Academies unequivocally stating that the evidence has only grown stronger, that the endangerment is real, and that there is more danger than ever, and that each additional pound of greenhouse gas emissions produced, which in the United States is dominantly from the energy sector, is actually introducing more danger. I am not your teaching team, but I would really encourage you to make yourself available to this text. It is the highest dose of concentration of the last decade of climate science and public welfare that the people who are most active on this issue in the National Academies could muster in very short order. But what do you do if you're despairing in a moment when you think that maybe the National Academies won't be enough for an administration that's famously attacking science, scientists, data, and data scientists? Will a PDF like this really make a difference? And that's where political scientists come back into the picture. What does civil action look like that can produce enough pressure to hold accountable representatives at any level, autocratic or democratic, to take action in human interests rather than those of their patrons? It's challenging. I'm very humbled to be asked to even speak on topics like this to you. And with just a few minutes, I want to take you through a single sentence that has helped me interpret the dynamics in a system that can be short-circuited. I'm going to take this sentence from the top to the bottom, and then I'm going to read it back from the bottom to the top. The capacity to enforce anything at the boundaries of an authority, that jurisdictional boundary, is what gives us the fragments, the pieces of all of the different policies that we see in the kaleidoscope. That's our tapestry. The word is tapestry. So you have a tapestry of policies, and all of those little jurisdictions each have an authority within them, and their layers, jurisdictions, federal, state policy, even corporate policies that are inside of them. There's political power that determines who's in charge, and there's an entire field of study of that political power called political science. The governing processes that are chosen by that framework of power and its projection makes the rules that frame the decisions of people that are buying and selling anything of their interest in what we describe as markets and try to compare to perfect market theory to see whether or not their behaviors are similar to what we would theorize. The incentives that are present in those market conditions, no matter what their conditions may be, distorted or perfect, ultimately motivates the movement of money to the solutions that may be responsive to a concern that requires a large scale and very, very rapid response. That is what will make either a large or a small difference where it matters most. And it turns out that it matters a lot whether the difference is small or large. So let's move this thing back. If you need a large transition, and it's going to matter to a large number of people everywhere for most of all human time, you will want to be reading this backwards to say, I have a very limited amount of time to get a very large perturbation to the policies that are framing the investments, which means I need to look upstream to what is framing these market conditions and who has the power to shape it, and how those governing systems are responsive to the arraignment of political power that is holding to account the people who themselves have the ability to enforce. How's that experience for you? Reading that sentence forward and then backwards. Give me like your thumbs like this. I'm following you. Got some thumbs. Work on it like you're flexing. Edit it. Make it your own. But I promise you that if you test it, if you challenge it and you say, I don't think that this relationship is real, that is a spark of curiosity you should follow. One of the things that is most important for me to describe to you, and my own illumination as a member of Jay Inslee's congressional staff in 2007 and 2008, is that it is very possible to distort these relationships by short-circuiting the expression of interests to political power by making direct payments to their interests. This entire system is so well known and regarded that it's watched like the Weather Channel through a federal office that collects data and publishes it very faithfully. This is the scale of money that was paid directly by oil and gas interests into the influence that they had to declare, not even the influence that they didn't have to declare, with a huge bump after this season right here when I worked for Congressman Jay Inslee in the first incarnation of cap and trade policies as they hit Capitol Hill. There was so much on the line for the energy incumbents and the distributive results of that negotiation that the spending rocketed. And that spending was so successful, it never subsided. It continued to have excellent returns for the patrons every year. So why? Why would this cottage industry of influence return to a prior pre-cap and trade state? The polar expression of interest is also well reported in the data. The multiples here are huge. 4-to-1, 5-to-1. And that bipartisan split is clear over a cumulative period of time that is accounted for even in only the limited amount of money for which any data is required to be reported in hundreds of millions of dollars. There were some fateful Supreme Court judgments about limits to spending in the political system at the federal level and also what would need to be reported and how. And as a result, the aftermath of those decisions sent a skyrocket in this group here called soft money outside groups. Very difficult to track, very difficult to attribute. But you can see exactly why then that there wouldn't be an uptick in the other two categories, because all new money flowing into that system for influence is finding other ways to meet their aims. We have to close. We're at the end of class. I didn't get to the very, very end, stories that I hope that you will continue to interrogate. Those of you that are participating in the policy workshop on Monday, I'll see you and I can offer some supplements to close. But I hope that I have been both provocative and persuasive, that you won't be able to understand energy or energy transitions without engaging policy and the politics that frame them in every jurisdiction in any country, city, or state that you've ever traveled in or lived in, and that as people who will surely be in a position in your future to participate in the practice of civic governance at some level, whether it's in a corporation or in civic service, understanding how policy is manifesting the problems that you're facing will help you be a good judge of the instruments that you choose to advance solutions. Thank you so much.
If you want to learn more about this topic or other energy topics, visit our Stanford Understand Energy Learning Hub for free resources, including signing up for our monthly Energy Spotlight. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and tap the notification bell to be notified for our newest content.